Let's move on to another group of caterpillars that one can find in a vegetable garden. Hornworms. Adults are called sphinx moths, and some of them are going to be called hummingbird moths, as we'll get into. But the hornworm stage, the caterpillar, is what is problematic for gardeners. Hornworms are large caterpillars, and they are about the largest kind of caterpillar one would ever find in a yard or garden. Most also have a horn at the hind end of the body, which is why they're called hornworms. And two species out of about 24 that occur in the region are problems in gardens, both of which are found in tomatoes. One is the tomato hornworm, one is the tobacco hornworm. And the large size of these caterpillars, I think, often causes some concern with gardeners. It is a very big insect, full grown. It might be 3 inches long, and the horn at the hind end, a little baffling. I think most gardeners think, were they to handle a hornworm, they might be able to rear back and sting them with that horn. But no, it's just an ornament. It's flexible appendage. It won't hurt you. Here's my kid Bill playing with hornworms when he was a little kid. He's blue in this picture, not because of the hornworm, but because he was painting. And here he is, still doing just fine, years later, playing with hornworms. They're harmless to us. They're just big caterpillars with that strange little horn off the hind end. Now, again, there's two species that are most often going to be found in gardens, and most often on tomatoes or closely related plants in the nightshade family. One is the tobacco hornworm. As we can see here, it is a moth, a large moth that lays eggs, that has a caterpillar. That is what we're going to find in our gardens, and in the pupal stage, it will occur in the soil. The other is the tomato hornworm. Again, same sequence of life stages: an adult with eggs that produce little larvae, that produce bigger larvae, and these also will pupate in the soil. There are differences between these two if you look at the caterpillars, and again, both of them may be found in the same garden. The differences with the tobacco hornworm, which is usually most common, is that on the top picture here, you can see that the stripes along the body are single stripes, and the horn is usually reddish. The lower two pictures are of a tomato hornworm, and you can see that you have V-shaped marks on the segments of the abdomen, and the horn is black. Occasionally we will get dark morphs indicated in the lower picture of the tomato hornworm, and they will not be green like we typically see them. But again, the patterning of the white dashes along the side of the body and the color of the horn is usually the easiest way to distinguish these two in the caterpillar stage. All of these start with eggs, and the eggs of a hornworm are fairly large because these are fairly large insects that have large moth stages. It's like a small pearl. You likely wouldn't see it, but then the eggs hatch, and you get a little hornworm with a little horn, or fairly large horn for its body. And they feed and molt and get bigger, and feed and molt and get bigger, and feed and molt and get bigger, and feed and molt and get bigger. And as they grow, they do progressively more damage. They feed a lot more as they get older. Ultimately, they may essentially defoliate large areas of the plant, so all you have is the larger veins. And on occasion, they may then chew on a green tomato or two, although that's not the primary damage. These are mostly indirect pests that we are concerned with because they will rapidly defoliate a plant when they get into the late stage caterpillar. And this insect illustrates something I think pretty well that has come up, and that is how fast insects feed in relation to what life stage they are. So someone may leave for the weekend, and their garden looks fine. They don't see any damage. Come back on Sunday night or look at it Monday night after they return from vacation and see extensive damage. It's been chewed up all over the place. And the typical response to this will be, well, where did these come from? Where did these caterpillars come from? You know, it looked fine 3 days ago, but now it's all chewed up. Well, what's happened in these kinds of situations is you have a caterpillar that has become a late stage, and caterpillars increase their the amount that they're going to eat sort of exponentially. So it might be typical for a caterpillar to be doing perhaps 80% of all the chewing it's going to do in the last 20% of the time it is a caterpillar. And if it's a caterpillar for 20 days, then the last 4 days might be when it's going to do 80% of all the feeding it's going to do. In the previous 16 days, it's going to do 20%. So we don't see it, but they kind of go into overdrive on that last stage, and that's when almost all the defoliation occurs. We see it then, and then we get ready to do something about it, and then before we know it, they're gone. After they have fed on the plant, they burrow into the soil, and they will pupate in the soil. And in this case, there's a spading fork in the back, and the pupal form of a hornworm. In this case, it's kind of like a small cigar in terms of size, and it's one of the largest odd objects you might be digging up in your garden, would be a hornworm pupa. And they are actually in a little soil cell that's been disturbed in these pictures, but they go into the soil, tamp out a little cell in the soil, and then pupate. They do not produce a cocoon. Most of the caterpillars that will go into the soil would not produce a cocoon. And then out comes the adult. So you have a larva that's feeding on the plants, goes into the soil, makes a little soil cell, out comes the adult. And the adult is a large moth. The adults of a hornworm we collectively call sphinx moths or hawk moths, and they are large-bodied, strong-flying moths, and they are capable of long-distance flight across county lines, probably across state lines often. So they are about the biggest moth and some of the strongest flying moths, and some of them are blown considerable distances in addition to being moving on their own wings at nighttime when they are usually flying. So hornworms turn into sphinx moths. So that's the adult form of what we would call a hornworm. And most sphinx moths fly at night, and we wouldn't see them. We don't see the adults of the tomato hornworm or the tobacco hornworm. They're night flyers, and they're visiting flowers, and they have extremely long mouth parts that can access some very deep flowers. They often will visit flowers that are only visited by sphinx moths or perhaps hummingbirds, which also have very long mouth parts that can access very deep flowers. Now, a couple of the sphinx moths are sometimes found out and about during the day. This isn't normal. I mean, this isn't common, and it only involves a couple of species. But when you find a day-flying sphinx moth, it's often popularly called a hummingbird moth. And this is not a bad name, because these moths are often roughly the size of a hummingbird moth, perhaps a little smaller, but they hover like a hummingbird moth. They extend their mouth parts and feed on flowers similar to a flower that a hummingbird would be feeding on. And they're kind of magical insects, and I think most gardeners, were they to see some hummingbird moths flying around the daytime, would often be intrigued by this. So this brings up a conflict. A gardener might be interested in seeing a hummingbird moth visiting the flowers during the daytime, but when they learn that a hummingbird moth is a sphinx moth, and a sphinx moth is a adult of a hornworm, and a hornworm is something that is a problem that you have in your tomatoes, well, they might be considering that this is a conflict. But is it? And it is not. And it's a little complicated to explain, but first of all, you have to understand that there's about 24 kinds of hornworms in this state. The great majority people never even notice. They're up in trees. They're in an ash tree or a cottonwood tree or an elm tree, or the white-lined sphinx is feeding on portulaca and ground cover weeds that we don't care about. So most of the hornworm species are not pests. So only two are, really, the tomato hornworm and the tobacco hornworm. Another 22, we don't even notice them feeding, so they wouldn't really be considered a pest. And then those two that we have an issue with, the tomato hornworm and the tobacco hornworm, don't fly during the day. And if we were to define a hummingbird moth as a moth that flies during the day, well, they're not hummingbird moths. The species that is almost always the moth that you see fly during the day that one would call hummingbird moth is known as the white-lined sphinx. It's the hummingbird moth of the West, and it is a type of sphinx moth or hawk moth that flies during the day. It is noted by having a strong white band on its forewing. There's one other group of moths that also fly during the day, and these are illustrated on the right, and those are called the bumblebee clearwings. And these look sort of like large bumblebees, but also fly during the day. They're an unusual group of sphinx moths that are also day flying. So the white-lined sphinx and the bumblebee clearwings are the big two. So hummingbird moth of the West would definitely be the white-lined sphinx. Far and away the most common of the day-flying sphinx moths, almost always the species you do see. And it is a species that is not one that has any serious habits that people would consider injurious to garden plants, except extreme cases. I mean, mostly they're feeding on plants that we don't care about, or might even be weeds. So the larva of the white-lined sphinx, indicated on the left in this slide here, can be variable in color, but they're feeding on a variety of plants that usually aren't considered crops, including purslane. Purslane is sometimes a pretty important garden pest, weed, and they love that. So they will be feeding mostly on plants that we don't even notice them on. And so here they are. They can feed quite a bit. So here's one, a dark phase one that is feeding on an early season host that's very common, which is evening primrose. In this case, they're feeding on the blossoms. Notice that the white-lined sphinx does have variation in color. They can be green, they can be quite dark. The other group of day-flying sphinx moths that I mentioned, much less commonly encountered, are the bumblebee clearwing sphinx. The hummingbird clearwing and the snowberry clearwing are the two species we have locally most commonly. We see them and they might look like a bumblebee. And we're one to purposely plant a garden in a way to attract and retain or get more visitation by these kinds of moths. There are certain kinds of flowers where you're going to see them. They like to go for flowers that have fairly complex, deep flowers that in order to get to the nectar that many kinds of other insects might not be able to access. So where you want to see more hummingbird moths, you might consider plants such as 4-o'clocks or evening primrose or larkspur or gentian, nasturtium, catmint, datura, winecup, or honeysuckle. And actually honeysuckle is particularly good because honeysuckle not only supports the adults as in the form of having flowers that they'd like to visit, but the bumblebee clearwings also develop on honeysuckle. If necessary, hornworms and cabbage worms can be easily controlled by many insecticides, including BT, Bacillus thuringiensis. This is not a tough insect to control. However, I think in most gardens, you don't have a whole lot of them, and it's a little more sporting, if nothing else, to maybe go hunt them down and dispatch them however you wish, by hand picking or maybe some more diabolical way of dispatching them. In this case, we have a pair of scissors taking out a hornworm, and I'm not going to show you the next picture, but we do have it, and I even have it on videotape. But they can be very difficult to see. You may know that there is something going on in your plants because you see these stakes or branches that have been turned into stakes because the leaves are all gone, and that's evidence that you've had hornworms, but you can't find them. They're often cryptically colored. Often how you might try to find out where they are is look on the ground, and they're little pellets. They've got these little six-sided pellets that they drop, will be located probably underneath where they have been most active during the past 24 hours. And look up from there. They're counter-shaded. and a little difficult to see. They often are a little further out on the plant in the morning than later in the day. So go out early, check the plants, check under the plants to get a tip on where they might be, and take care of them how you wish. And one last thing about hornworms, occasionally you might see a very interesting natural enemy of this insect, and it is a kind of parasitic wasp that develops within the body of the hornworms, and when it is full grown, it emerges and spins little cocoons on the body. So this parasitic wasp, Catesia congregatus, is a type of parasitic wasp associated with many kinds of hornworms that is not common, but can be an interesting thing to see when you do find one in your yard and